I'm Nate Eaton talking with Frank Montoya, a former special agent in charge at the FBI. Frank, you've been retired now 2 or 3 years?
Almost, yeah, 3.5, 4,
Three
almost
and a
4.
half, four. Wow. Time sure has flown.
Good.
Frank has worked in offices all across the country, spent his career working with the FBI. And I wanted to ask Frank today your thoughts now that these indictments have come down against Chad and Lori Daybell. It seems like it's been a long time coming, and they were dropped yesterday.
Yeah. I think that what this really does is it illustrates how a complex case, especially one with all these twists and turns, where the so-called bad guys are actively engaged in trying to cover up their behavior, their activities, their acts. It just goes to illustrate just how time consuming, how intensive, how difficult it can be, and to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. I mean, we absolutely knew that there was a crime that had been committed. There are 3 victims, 2 children and a wife. And there was a lot of indicators that these victims were the victims of foul play. And it was up to the investigators and the prosecutors working with them to put all those pieces together to the point where they could bring the charges that they brought yesterday.
Were you surprised to see the charges, Frank? The first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, the insurance fraud, the grand theft?
I was not, and it for a number of reasons. First and foremost, were the fact that JJ and Tylee were found buried on that property like they were, and that their bodies were in the conditions, or their corpses were in the conditions that they were. That did not seem like accidental or accidental, I guess is the best way to put it, or unintended. That seemed very, very direct. The question was, how do you tie your suspects to the acts of murder? And I think that what you saw in the indictments yesterday, a very good effort by the prosecution to show indications of premeditation. Everything from the internet searches to test firing weapons to scouting out locations to being in suspicious places at suspicious times. And so, it was all about bringing all the pieces of the puzzle together, whether it was forensics or it was cyber related, involving in the computers, the iPads, the cell phones, the drop phones or burn phones, to whatever witness testimony was out there to corroborate their theory of the crime in essence, and in terms of being able to prove it. I mean, that's one of the really big challenges in these kinds of cases is you pretty much know who did it, but you still have to prove that they did it. And putting the pieces of the puzzle together are not as easy as it might seem, or as it occurs on a 60-minute crime show on television. It really is a painstaking, lengthy process.
And that leads to my next question is, that this took a year and a half for these indictments to come down. And along the way, there's been kind of little nuggets the prosecution has dropped about cell phone pings and GPS locations and, geotagging, things like that. They've got to have a lot more than what they've released publicly, especially with the severity of these charges. And you mentioned the fact that on the night Tammy Daybell died, they knew that Alex Cox was 2.5 miles away at the church. Well, what else do they have from that night? I mean, there's got to be so much more. Why do you think they withheld some of that? And why do you think they released what they did?
Yeah, a great question. I mean, going back to Alex Cox, for instance, if in fact he's the individual that fired or attempted to fire those shots at Tammy, I believe it was on October 9th or October 12th, the guy in dark colored clothing with the mask on, were they misfires, or did the rounds go off and they just missed? And if the rounds went off and they missed, do they have the forensic evidence of that? Did the bullets, for instance, impact in a wall or in a vehicle or in some other location that they might have recovered them? So, yeah, there are still a lot of pieces of the puzzle that still need to be aired publicly. But I think that it's very prudent that the prosecution lays out a sufficiently detailed indictment or a set of charges and explanation for those charges, while at the same time not exposing everything, because they still got for the most part, a prosecution to look forward to. I mean, there's a possibility of plea agreements. That's always a possibility, especially when defendants start realizing that the charges are not only serious and real, but that there's some meat behind them. But the other part of that is that if there is no pleas, they still have to bring these folks to trial. And you don't want to reveal all of your trial strategy in your indictment. It's just not wise to do that, because that provides the defense with many more opportunities to craft its own defense. Now, the defense will get an opportunity to see what evidence the prosecution has and the investigators have collected through the discovery process, which will happen prior to any trial. But at the same time, this is about protecting, one, the integrity of the investigation, and two, preparing yourself for the best possible prosecution possible. And that, if that means, holding on to some key parts of that information until time for trial, then that's what you do in order to have maximum effect or impact on your on your presentation of your prosecution.
And this is a trial that could be a year and a half away. If the prosecution decides to go for the death penalty, it will be at least a year, because they do a really thorough deep dive into both of the suspects' backgrounds, basically a life sketch, you could say. Or you mentioned a plea agreement. Having served in the FBI, knowing that the prosecution probably has so much evidence, do you foresee Chad or Lori taking a plea agreement, or are they going to go to their grave or serve life in prison with these religious beliefs that they've publicly espoused?
It's another great question. They've both had now the opportunity to spend a lot of time in a county lockup, in a jail,
separated from each other.
Exactly right. The next step is, if they don't plea, is a trial, and if there is a conviction, then it's no longer in a county jail anymore, but actually in a state penitentiary. So that's even more separation. That's farther away from even family members, and so in terms of anyone that may want to visit with them, it just becomes it's a much more difficult environment. You're not around familiar people anymore, and it's for first degree murder. If it's not a death penalty case, it still can be a life sentence, and that's got to be going to their minds right now. It's got to be going to their counsel's minds in terms of what they might recommend to them in terms of future actions, and in terms of either going to trial or accepting a plea agreement. And then the question is, who will break first? Is he going to look out after his own self-interest first, or is she going to look after hers? Or very rarely do they both come to the same quote unquote come to Jesus moment where they decide to confess their sins. That the religious aspect is a dynamic. Are they super committed? Was it just a front or a cover for sex and greed, a lust for money? It's a good question. And as they're sitting in their cells and this becomes more real to them, and I guess their initial appearances are today on the new charges. Once that happens, this is real. This is not a fantasy. It's not fake news. It's the real deal. And how are they going to deal with it? What is the counsel they're going to get from their attorneys? And then where do we go from here? Do they play it out a little bit longer? Do they stick to their guns, so to speak, until the bitter end, or something in the middle? And that remains to be seen. In many different cases, it has many different outcomes, and we'll see how this one ends as well. That in that regard.
Frank Montoya, appreciate your insight, your expertise, and it's been a fascinating thing to observe, and we'll see what the next year or so brings.
It has been, and if I could just say, I've been talking a lot about this in the past few months, and in terms of the law enforcement partnerships up there. I mean, when you look at this, local, state, and federal, it doesn't always come together very conveniently or nicely, but at the same time, the strength of the partnerships in this instance were very evident in terms of just all the things that they were able to get done. When you look at the multiple jurisdictions, when you look at the different kinds of evidence that need to be explored and exploited, whether it was cyber related or it was behavioral sciences, or it was forensics, or it was just getting people on the ground and to start knocking on doors and asking questions, or getting online and searching fields for any little bit of evidence. I mean, the cooperation is what makes this work. I mean, sometimes you feel like, hey, I can do this all by myself, but the reality is no one can do it all by themselves. And the more help you have, just a little bit easier it gets. And it's also great to have different sets of eyes on the process, because somebody may miss something and then somebody else picks up on it, and you're able to exploit it and pick up those pieces of information that your suspects have taken so much time and effort to try to hide or twist or deflect or destroy. And justice, the point of justice being served for these victims, for JJ, Tylee, and Tammy, it absolutely depended on the cooperation and efforts of all of these agencies working together. And that's what you saw yesterday, was a culmination of that effort. By the way, you did a great job on this, spearheading this. I mean, keeping the spotlight on this kind of thing, it can get lost in all of the other noise that's out there. Well, more importantly, you help justice get served. It's not always pleasant, that process, but you were a part of it. You were part of making this happen. And it's not over yet. We'll see if they plead or if they go to trial, and exactly how much evidence the prosecution has. But you don't bring first-degree murder unless you can make it. So you got to get to that point before you can pop the champagne corks. But at the same time, you contributed to this, and that this is an instance where the media really can be helpful in an investigation. So kudos,
Thanks,
man.
Frank. I appreciate it.